Hello, this is Dan with Veterans for Peace Forum, and I want to welcome you tonight. We have a special guest, Douglas Lain, who is a publisher of Zero Books. He's a novelist, science fiction writer, and a good friend. Doug is also a blogger and has a podcast. His first novel, entitled Billy Moon, and we've had him on the program at that time to talk about that book, tells the story of Christopher Robin Milne, fictional involvement with the French general strike in May of 1968, and was released from Tor Books on August 27th of 2013. His second book, which I am just into the 11th chapter, I've been was hoping to finish it this weekend, but I was unable to get that done. The book is entitled After the Saucers Landed. It's about a Fluxus artist and how do you say that? Ufologist who sinks into a deep depression after aliens arrive on schedule. Lain's first podcast, entitled Diet Soap, ran for over 5 years. And you might ask, why this is Veterans for Peace Forum. Why do I have Doug on here? We're not talking about a veterans issue. Well, because veterans are not just people talking about war. We also read books. We also are dealing with issues in our communities, our humanity, and a lot of things that led me to my beliefs as a political activist and a person who believes in peace and the end of war in this world comes from ideas that I picked up in books and knowledge and friends and personal experiences. So, once upon a time, I remember being out in the desert and I saw these saucers flying around. And no, I'm just kidding. But these are some of the things that we have to begin to discuss. Doug has also just published, a little article in truthdig.org, one of my favorite online newspapers, and the title of that was, What Was Marx Really Saying? So we're going to delve into a couple of different things as we move on into the show, but I wanted to talk before we get started, and I told Doug there'd be a little bit of a surprise here. And one of the things that's happening in Portland, I went to a movie last night, and at Cinema 21, and they have, it's the Portland German Art Film Festival that's going on. Cinema 21 has that on, and there was a woman who actually I met at an event. Her name was Katyama Riedman. She happens to be an actress in the film and was present at the opening of the film. What was interesting, the film itself kind of reminds me of what kind of a few things that happen in this book, and it's different, but it was a powerful film. I just want to read a little bit about what the film is about here, and let's see if I can get that here. It's the movie that I watched last night was called The Misplaced World, and it's a Paul Kronberger discovers a photo on the internet of a U.S. opera diva, and Paul is supposed to be Katrina's father in this film. She's playing Katrina, who is a split image of Evelyn. Evelyn is his dead wife, and so he starts asking his daughter to. He shows her the picture, and she said, "Oh my God, this is a doppelganger." This looks like Mom just died though a few years ago, and it can't be her. And he says, but it's her. She's haunting me. He's having dreams, and so he actually sends her on a mission to go and find her. And she happens to be Katrina is Fabian is a splitting image of Evelyn, and she's an opera singer, and through this, his daughter is sent on this mission to go find her, and she also is kind of a jazz singer, and music seems to be in the household. And this whole story is a bizarre thing in which Katrina does not want to talk about it. She's disturbed by the whole thing. And her mother is in a rest home and has dementia. And this whole idea of trying to identity and understanding who you are is all a part of this film. But it ends up being, and I'm not going to give it away because it's a story you have to go see, but it's an interesting and well done film, some incredible stories going on. But something in your book, Doug, that kind of interests me about this, and the reason I wanted to bring this film up, is this high idea of identity, this idea of somebody taking your personality. And in part of your book, I mean, there's the, you might just tell people a little bit about the book, as to give them a little history on what it's about.
So can I hold up the book now?
You may hold up the book now. Hold it a little higher.
Okay.
There you go.
So this is the book. It's called After the Saucers Landed, and it does have a lot to do with identity. It has a lot to do with the way that, well, there's a notion that people have in academic philosophy right now that's popular. Judith Butler popularized this notion, or maybe didn't popularize it at all, but theorized on it. And it's a notion that identity is performative, that who you are is determined by how you act in the world, more than something that is your essence, that drives you to act. You find out who you are through acting. And I wanted to take that notion really seriously, and so I decided that the characters in the book, the people in the book, would truly be defined by how they behaved, and that pattern of how to behave as, say, a ufologist or an artist could move from one person in the story to another. So, and with the help of the aliens who had arrived.
And they're called what?
Pleiadians.
Pleiadians.
They're from the Pleiades. And that's not actually my conception. There's actually a whole mythology about the Pleiadians, or Pleiadians maybe is how you say it, but that comes from the 50s, from the contactee culture. So in ufology, in the early days, there were simply sightings. And then a little later on, the 50s and 60s, there was this movement or this idea that some people had been contacted by the aliens of various types, but usually the people who would claim contact would claim that the aliens were angelic, sort of Swedish-looking or Nordic-type aliens, humans. And then after that, the kind of stories you would hear would be about these little gray aliens that are so dominant today that people think of when they think about aliens with the black eyes and short, sort of E.T. looking, or like Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters. So those aliens came later. But I was writing about these 50s aliens who, were blonde-haired and blue-eyed and would come down with cosmic wisdom to give the contactees, usually poor farmers or, people who on the outskirts of town, who would then come, with their photos and their wisdom, and usually try to make a buck off of the contact that it supposedly happened. So that's what I take that idea as. I take that seriously. Like, what if these aliens really did exist, and what if they really made themselves known to us and tried to bring their religion to the world? What would that look like? And I said it in 1991, just because, because that was because that was a time in my life where I was interested in UFOs in a serious way, and later on I came to decide that really wasn't something.
It's kind of strange because we met shortly after that.
Well, you convinced me shortly after we met that
I was an alien,
that you were an alien, and therefore I need not take the idea of aliens seriously. But yeah, but anyway, so those are the two things in the story. But these aliens in my novel have the capacity to help humans change their identity or exchange their identity. So like I originally thought up the idea of this story, thinking about a cocktail party or a block party or something like that, where an alien would be there and he would decide that the host of the party should stop being the host, that one of the guests should now take the host's place, become John Smith, say, stay and live there, and that the host would then go home with the the woman who had come with him at the beginning of the party. So in other words, it was just me trying to justify key parties. No, but yeah. So I came up with that idea and then developed it in the book to try to explore what it means to have an identity or to have a personality.
Well, let's take a look here at a couple of reviews some people had said. I pulled this offline by a guy named Andrew, and Club Reader. And aliens have landed, but far from the beginning of a new golden era, as so often envisioned by science fiction, and the encounter proves to be a massive disappointment. Initial meeting happens just the way Hollywood B movies have always envisioned it, right down to the hubcap-shaped flying saucers landing in front of the White House. The aliens look just like us, they talk just like us, they even have flying saucers filled with antiquated technologies like punch card operated mainframes. The reality of aliens is so banal that their existence triggers a series of suicides throughout the American ufologists. The story of their arrival is told through the eyes of Brian Johnson. He's your main character here. Yeah. A literature professor whose life turned upside down when one of the aliens subsumes his wife's identity. As Johnson is confronted with the increasing disorienting losses of time, he is soon forced to confront the fact that identity, memory, and reality may move more fluid than humans have ever imagined. After the Saucers Landed is a masterpiece, wow, of slipstream, which is good, a genre defined by cognitive dissonance. As such, it is anything but straightforward narrative. Doug Lain tells the story of humanity's first contact with an alien race in a non-linear fashion through rapid series of increasing disorienting jumps to imply loss of time in a manner similar to that of Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five or Christopher Nolan's film Mementos. That can make a book challenging to read at times, but the gambit ultimately proves very satisfying. The Google generation will love the way Lain litters his novel with references calculated to send readers running to Wikipedia. Set in the 60s and 70s, a book that drops references to art, B-movie, cinema, literature, along the 60s and 70s culture, and almost is on almost every page, and resembling a simpler, more sincere narrative voice of the masters of the golden age of science fiction, like Isaac Asimov. I mean, that's quite.
That is good. That was something written up on a book club site.
Yeah,
and I'm suspicious of that because he's right. Of course, it is a masterpiece. But it wasn't set in the 60s and 70s.
No.
Some of the story does take place there, sort of memories that the main ufologist has. Harold Flint is the ufologist. And actually, I would say he's the main character, and the narrator, who you spend a lot of time with, is Brian Johnson. But you spend a lot more time with Brian Johnson than you do with Harold Flint, but you spend time with Brian Johnson telling you about Harold Flint. So I think Harold Flint's the main character, and he's a Fluxus artist, and the Fluxus was an art movement that began in the 60s and
which is a good thing
70s.
To kind of explain a little bit.
Yeah, Fluxus was a U.S. avant-garde movement that was aimed at bringing art to everyday life. A lot of what happened, or what they would produce, would be small objects that they could mail, so a lot of it was mail art. Postcards, little trinkets. But the two biggest names, I think, in Fluxus would be Yoko Ono and John Cage, both of which were musicians. Although Yoko Ono did a lot of different kinds of performance work and sculpture and that as well. But the main thing about Fluxus is that they were influenced by Duchamp. They influenced conceptual art, which came after. And they wanted to break down the barriers between what's considered art and what's considered life. and make it something, and make it more democratic. So give anyone the capacity to make art, which is what was kind of behind the mail art type movement that was in it. But they also did events. They created happenings,
Right.
which they would sometimes document and sometimes not. So there's very much a 60s and early 70s kind of quality to Fluxus art. And that appealed to me. It was a very American avant-garde.
Yeah, we had talked about that in private among ourselves before, and for me it was Joseph Beuys, who was sort of the Fluxus artist.
Yeah.
Sort of a kind of mysticalism with his work too. But
Yeah.
I think that's where they're talking about. People run to Wikipedia to find out what you're talking about, because these
Right.
references that you bring up. I had to do the very same thing when it came to John Cage. I really didn't know him, and you can't know everything. But so you have these wonderful references. You might explain what I mean. John Cage was somebody who made music from sound, and it had that sort of minimalist kind of idea too.
He wasn't really a minimalist. That came after, like people like Philip Glass and Steve Reich. What he did was called chance music. So he did definitely use sound to create music, and tried to again erase the boundary between art and life, or music and noise, or music and nature.
Or that is music.
Yeah, that nature, that natural sounds, whether natural could be in a city,
Right.
like the honking of a horn, or people walking, or a plane flying overhead, or I don't know, a gas station exploding. And these are all things that I think of when I think of a city, I guess. And then, or nature could be out in the world, out in the woods, with a stream, or the sound of grass growing, or I don't know. Nature, it's not for me. But the minimalism, just real briefly, minimalism would pick up harmony, would work within the Western tradition more, and use basic harmonies, and was a return more to what people think of as music than what John Cage did, which was often seemingly random. There was a work that I got wrong that's in the book,
right,
where he played like a bathtub and potted plants and a rubber duck in a sequence on an American talk show or American game show or something like that.
It was What's My Line?
What's My Line? I thought it had been Ed Sullivan, and I got that wrong. It was not Ed Sullivan. It was What's My Line.
But I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't gone to Wikipedia.
Yeah, you had to go to Wikipedia and find out how it was wrong.
Yeah.
And another thing is, I say Spielberg's movie Close Encounters was made by MGM at one point. It wasn't. It's Columbia Pictures.
But it's fiction,
Yeah,
right?
my friend Jim called me up and said, you got that wrong. Like, my fact checkers at Nightshade are not doing their job. But yeah.
Yeah. But, I mean, that reminded me, though, John Cage reminded me of my study when I was looking at the futurist artists. So we're doing similar, so as the Dadaists. Doing similar things.
Dada especially, I think, was an influence on... This was, in a way, Fluxus was an American Dadaist movement. There was definitely an absurdity to the work that would be produced. And so why did I have my ufologist also be a Fluxus artist? I'm asking.
And these happenings.
Well, he used the happenings as a way to investigate UFOs.
Right.
It was, instead of hypnotizing his subjects, he'd make them create art with them to try to figure out what the UFOs were about. But the reason why, the justification for why I even had that character there, is that in reality, there was an artist who was not a member of Fluxus. He was an abstract expressionist painter named Bud Hopkins, who's really pretty famous in the realm of hokey, UFO research. So he wrote many books. He's been on television, and I actually talked to him for my podcast and interviewed him about art more than the flying saucers.
So you have a podcast too? We might put. I think we have something.
Yeah, I have a podcast.
They can go on your.
If they just go to douglaslane.com or douglaslane.net.
Up on the screen here too.
They can find the podcast I'm doing now.
Okay.
The original, and I think there's some. If you go scroll down enough, you might find some old episodes of the other podcasts too. But I did a podcast called Diet Soap from 2009 to the end of 2014.
Right.
And then I started working at Zero Books, and I took my podcast over to this publishing house and did it for them. And can I hold up these now?
No.
Okay.
No.
Can I hold up this?
No.
What can I hold up? I got to hold up things.
Yeah, let me hold you up. No,
Okay.
I'll hold you up for a minute.
Hold me up, yeah.
I mean, before you do that, I mean, I sort of titled this after something you wrote in my book here too,
Oh, yeah?
Dan. You are not who you think you are, and I mean, I started when I just trying to figure out what that is and reading through the book. I mean, I became so confused because I think, therefore I am. I am because therefore I think. I started saying, well, who am I? And a part of the book starts...
I've been saying that for years.
Yeah, you've been asking me that for years. And
Yeah.
I started thinking that when you're talking about these people, I mean, there's a physical identity. They're sitting down and talking in
Right.
the sort of happening or a place being investigated, trying to tell the story. This person has changed to this person changed to this. But who are they? Is that my wife? Or is that his
Right.
wife?
Yeah.
And was she a artist model? And then it was like, well, wait a minute. They are somebody, but it's the patterns of people. And then I began to think, who are we? Are we our physical beings that we see? Are we in this sort of world of illusions? How do we see ourselves in the world of politics and on the media? Any of these things that we might be doing. And I started thinking, we are part of. We are the patterns that you were talking about. There's a certain. It's not our physical. People know us by how we behave, how we act, these sort of certain patterns. That's how we will recognize. Because if you did have a doppelganger somewhere, how would you recognize the person? How would they be different? Or identical twins, how would they be different? You would have to know that person more intimately on how they live their lives, or certain things that you can recognize about them. What do they remember, and what do you remember about them?
Right.
Is that?
Yeah, that's definitely. I mean, in this book, people exchange personalities, but their bodies don't change. So, they still, but they act so much differently. There's something about the personality that really is separate from their physical selves. And maybe, I don't go into this, but I imagine that their physical body would change sometime after the personalities are exchanged. So they're identical to the way they looked before, but you look different after you change personalities. But yeah, there's a character in this book who meets her doppelganger, meets a woman, an alien, who has taken on her personality. But this alien is a little bit taller than she is, and she's not identical to her in physical appearance, but she somehow communicates a kind of being, a way of going that is recognizable. And for the woman who encounters her, not only is it recognizable, it's admirable. It's like encountering not just who you really are, but who you want to be, how you think of yourself, the best version or a better version of herself in a certain sense. And so it's an interesting scene. Writing that took me a little while to work that out. But the main thing that I'd say I was trying to do, the book I wrote before, Billy Moon, was an overtly political book. It was about May 1968. It was about political revolution. This book is not overtly political, but I hold that the way that we are, the who we are, is caught up in how we live, and that how we live is not a fixed thing. That has changed historically, and that we have the power to change that, not just as individuals in our own lives, but collectively, so that we could change the way we live and the basis for the way we live so dramatically that we would be alien to ourselves at the end of that process. Maybe in a good way, maybe in a hokey way, but but nonetheless, that was sort of part of the reason why I wrote the book. And as I wrote it, the implications of what it means to think that way sort of forced themselves on me and made me write a very strange book.
Well, this is Brian Johnson's wife in this thing, right? Isn't he? And he's where she's been kidnapped and this whole thing, and he can't find his wife. He wants to know where she is. At the same time, he's starting to question whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Are these aliens trying to take over or deconstruct the whole human race? Right?
Yeah.
Where were you going with that? And
You haven't finished it.
I haven't, no.
I'm not going to get to the end for you. So I'm not going to tell you that.
Oh, so that's the conclusion, huh? Or does it conclude?
I think that we could have this conversation more fully after you read the ending. I'm not going to. I'll say this: that the question of whether or not the aliens that are good or bad starts to be irrelevant when you get to a point where you don't know who the aliens are anymore. There's a scene in the book which maybe makes it more difficult to figure out who is really originally an alien and who is really a human or a character in the book, and where those divisions are. And it's. I hope the book is kind of fun to read too, not just confusing.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about science fiction. Why is science fiction a genre that sort of tries to figure out what humanity is about, and it's dealing with the political strains in our society, humanity, war, the other. There's the alien, the somebody else. It could be, they're coming to invade us or they're coming to save us.
Well, I don't know why science fiction is. I mean, there's clearly lots of different ways to write, and you can address these same issues.
Yeah.
And for me, the reason I like to write science fiction is because you can ask questions in a science fiction novel that break the barrier of the individual. So in a realist novel, you are usually asking questions which are relatively constrained by the life that you imagine for your character in this world that we know. Whether it's, that world is, Imperial Japan or, New York City today or, Iran, it's still limited to, the world as it has been or as it is, and the kinds of people that you could imagine might live in these situations. Whereas a science fiction novel starts with what kind of world can I imagine, or what kind of world is this one, and what kind of world could it be? So it's more future looking science fiction, and it's more philosophical, and it isn't constrained by the realism as it's known now. So yeah, that's why I like science fiction and fantasy. Also, I'm a big geek, and I enjoy science fiction ideas. I love Star Trek, and I love even Star Wars. Although I watched Star Wars last night and fell asleep immediately because I've seen it so many times. It's like white noise to me. But anyway, those are my answers.
Okay. Well, then I would recommend that people actually. It's a great book. They should pick it up. I hope to finish it still this weekend. And I enjoyed Doug's other book, Billy Moon. But I think and that's not a science fiction book. It's a totally different kind of process. It's a novel.
Yeah.
But you're now a publisher for Zero Books. And so what does it mean to be a publisher, first of all? Yeah.
These days, I don't know. It's. I mean, the publishing house main office is in London. So it's John Hunt Publishing that owns 38 different imprints, including Zero Books. I'm the publisher, but what that means in this case is not that. I mean, you think of a publisher like you think of a movie producer, right? So with the movie producer, they're the ones who come up with the money and pay for the movie to be made, and that's what a publisher does. But so in that sense, I'm not the publisher because I'm not paying for. I'm paid by the publishing company. I'm something more like an editor. And I select what books will be published, and I work with authors on their books. But I'm also a publicist for the press, so I work on getting promotion for the books. And I'm also an author. I'm writing a book for Zero Books. But the main thing that I do is find people who I want to work with and encourage them to write for us, or they find me and send in book proposals or books that they've already written, and I decide whether or not we want to work with them.
Well, Zero Books, though, is a certain type of publisher.
Oh, right. It's
Yeah.
a left-wing commie. It's a philosophical, cultural book publisher. So we've got books like, it's out of the UK.
Hold it up a little higher there. Yeah, there you go.
We've got this one, which is How to Dismantle the NHS in 10 Steps, which is actually telling the story of how this was done to the NHS and what the plans from the Tories would be to how to take apart universal health care in the UK. And it's a book objecting to that, of course. We've got a book on called Superstructural Berlin, which is a theoretical book about, but a fun one about what is Berlin and what kinds of things happen there. It has a section on drugs, it has a section on the new information economy and on the art world. This is a very good book by Richard Skinner. These other are good too, but this is one that's different from those. It's a collection of essays and interviews just about literature. So this is more the cultural.
It's a critique of literature, or
not.
is it,
It's more of a celebration of works that this author, who's a novelist, really admires. So we've got essays on Italo Calvino and William Burroughs and Werner Herzog, his films, and so it's just a sort of a literary exploration of different kinds of works.
And how is it a leftist?
Well, the press is generally leftist, but I would say that anybody who's cultured is going to be on the left.
Okay.
So this is it includes books that are just on art and art theory or literary theory. So it's culture and politics would be another way to think about what Zero Books does. Here's one. It's a complete analysis of the books of the songs of David Bowie
By Chris O'Leary.
Chris O'Leary, who's a blogger for Beyond the Dame, I think is what it's called. Let me double check that. I should know this. He's Pushing Ahead of the Dame is the name of his blog. And this is his book on all of David Bowie's songs from 1964 to 1976. And then he's going to do a second volume of everything from 76 on. And then one of our most popular authors is Eugene Thacker, who wrote a book called In the Dust of This Planet. This is not that one. This is a second in that series of about essays about how the horror genre is a critique of philosophy.
The tentacles longer than the night.
The tentacles longer than the night. And this author, Eugene Thacker, was attacked by Glenn Beck. And that's what really made this book sell well, or the one before it, In the Dust of This Planet. Somehow Glenn Beck caught wind of this book and caught wind that Zero Books exists and went on a show and started railing against nihilism and progressives. Which was great for us. And Glenn, if you are watching this, which you're surely not, this book is also really bad, and you should mention it on your show because it's left-wing propaganda.
And what about your anthology here?
Oh yeah, I have one other book. This was recently reviewed in the New Yorker.
Yes.
It's called In the Shadow of the Towers. This is a collection of short stories and novel excerpts that have something to do with or take either as their theme or as their actual location in New York during the 9/11 attacks.
So you edited this. You have a story in there yourself?
I put one of my own in here.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the big names in this anthology would be Cory Doctorow and James Morrow and Bruce Sterling and Jeff Vandermeer and Susan Polwick. They're all terrific writers, and it's doing well. It's selling well, and I hope that people read it because it's, on September 11th it got some buzz.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, then we're talking about Zero Books being sort of a leftist thing, and you got published in Truth Dig. What was Marx really saying?
Yeah.
And so, what was Marx really saying? What was the?
Well, it would take a little while.
I know, but just in this article, what were you saying in that?
I didn't write that headline. It's a little misleading because it makes people think that I'm going to tell them everything that Marx is really saying.
Yeah.
But
It seems a lot simpler than that.
what the point of it was is that we have a popular conception of Marx today that since 2008, say since the recession, Marx has gained in popularity, but what's become popular is more of an image of Marx than any of his actual ideas. And there's a lot of notions that are put forward as Marxist which don't have much to do or anything to do with what Marx actually said. And there are a few examples I give in there. The examples I chose were relatively random. There was a couple of YouTube videos that talked about Marx. But I would say that overall, people today talk about Marx as if Marx was for, his main point was that we needed to redistribute the wealth, which it wasn't. That wasn't his main point. And that being working class made you feel alienated. That wasn't his point either.
But it's part of his point.
It was not about being the way you feel.
Right. Well, this is the part where you talk about tuition versus
intuition versus thinking. But
you're not against that either.
I'm not against intuition, but intuition is always a starting point.
Yes, that's what.
But too often we take our intuition as a verification. Like if something seems counterintuitive, you just reject it. So like if I say Marx wasn't for redistributing the wealth, that's counterintuitive. That's not how most people think about Marx. They think about Marx and Robin Hood like in the same breath. And they didn't have the same aims, or certainly they didn't. They may have even had the same aims. They didn't, but they didn't have the same analysis. Marx, but on the subject of alienation, Marx did feel that the worker was debased and demoralized and lived often enough poorly, and that was not acceptable. Especially in Capital, he talks at length about child labor and the kinds of conditions that children had to live with. But when he talked about alienation, though, he wasn't talking about the way people felt at the end of a 36-hour day and how they didn't feel connected to what they had produced. He talked about how the value of the commodities that they produced would actually become less valuable as they worked faster. So you are actually, what he would say is you're alienated because the more you work, the better you become at working and producing things, the less value you have as a worker. Because the better you are at producing value, the less value you're going to be able to produce. Which is because the faster you produce things, the less value is in the object. So there's a whole realm of theory that you have to kind of understand in order for anything that I just said to make sense. It has to do with Marx's labor theory of value, so the hours that were worked or what's being embodied in a commodity. All of these things need to be looked at and understood before you can even start to say whether or not what Marx said is true or not, or to what degree you want to agree with Marx. But what people do now is they hold up Marx as just a figure who was radically against capitalism. And that's when they say I'm a Marxist, they mean I don't like rich people, or I don't like the way the world works right now. But that's not enough. One of the big things that Marx was doing actually was writing critiques of other socialists. He had the critique of the Gotha program. He had big fights with Bakunin. Let's see if I can. And he was not simply anti-capitalist. He had a very specific set of ideas, very specific theories that he developed.
Him and Engels, though, would
work
together on this.
So I don't like to talk about Engels.
Well, I'm sitting here, was reading this, and it said Marx's theory wasn't about feelings. It wasn't psychological. It was about how the phenomena of private property, profit, rent, and wages intrinsic to capitalism function to create a class divisions and impoverish, debased workers. There's something else I was reading here earlier. I can't remember what it was here. So you're going into in this. I mean, I have a feeling that you and I argue about tuition and stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And I do feel that tuition isn't
Intuition.
Intuition. Well, when you to it, yeah.
Right.
But intuition isn't something that just is a phenomena in a sense that it just comes out of nowhere. It actually comes, to me, it comes from what you've read, what you've been a part of. So if intuition is leading you to have a conclusion or an idea about something, it's really it may be a subconscious part of trying to understand the things that you've been reading and trying to understand and study, but you can't come to a full conclusion without going back and critically reading that material, so you have some sort of thing. It'd be like creating a hypothesis.
Right.
You have a sense or a hint that something is happening there. So when somebody says to me that, well, there's something wrong with the world out here, that's intuition, based upon observation, and then you're trying to figure out a way, and, well, what is it that is really causing this problem, right? Now, Marx had a view of looking at the structures of capitalism and how it works as money in our society, and how production. But you talked about how the workers were already depossessed when it starts. So Marx talks about that it wasn't that capitalism depossessed them so much as that they were already depossessed, and then capitalism made it available to them.
Well,
I'm
there
trying
was
to-
a process of, to be really honest about this, if you ask me the question of how did capitalism come to be, I'm not someone who's qualified to really answer that. I don't know enough about I haven't read.
theory.
I've been reading Capital,
Right.
but I haven't read everything that Marx has written, and I also haven't read everything that other people have written, and I'm not a historian. But my understanding of capitalism is that it expands as it develops, so that it can exist without existing everywhere, and it doesn't exist everywhere at the same level. There's uneven development. So in England, there was a process of expansion, which meant that the peasants were made landless, the commons were foreclosed, and that became capital, and those peasants became workers at that point. But at what exact moment capitalism as we know it existed, I couldn't say.
So sort of the Industrial Revolution is a part of that?
It's probably before the what we
Revolution.
think of as the Industrial Revolution, or like there's like a question that actually is a scientific question, but it's also just a cliche. It's like, which came first, the chicken or an egg, right? So like, how do things change from, like, how did feudalism change into capitalism is sort of the same question. Like, how did we get this new way of living and new way of producing the world, and at what point did that transition become complete? And so the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, is that the chicken came first, but the chicken that came first was the proto-chicken, was somewhere in between what came. So
It was from a flying saucer.
right,
but-
I don't know. So I don't know precisely the process of how capitalism came into being. I think that there are people who've probably written for Zero Books and other companies that know that answer better than I do.
Yeah. So, but you've been struggling with this. I mean, you also are talking about you're doing a podcast where you were teaching about capital.
I am working with, I would say it's more of a autodidactic process. So I'm learning about capital and talking about it. It's like a book reading group. But one of the people that is participating in that with me is a man named Andrew Kleiman, who wrote a book called The Failure of Capitalist Production, and Reclaiming Marx's Capital is another book that he's written. And he is a very knowledgeable and kind of controversial figure on the Marxist left. And he holds to he holds the radical opinion and the controversial opinion that you can read Marx and understand him and understand Marx's writings without having to first read Lenin and Adorno or Lukács or any of these, or having to read your party's newspapers.
Oh, okay.
You know, like
Yeah,
you should read Marx, and then you know you can
Go to the source.
Yeah, go to the source, read what Marx actually wrote, try to figure out what he actually said. The history of Marxism has been a history of reinterpretation and breaking from Marx. Sometimes maybe not completely unjustifiably, sometimes unjustifiably. There are some key issues in Marxism that that are controversial, like whether or not underconsumptionism is the way to go in understanding economic crisis, or the tendency for the rate of profit to decline is the way to go. Kleiman sides strongly with that second category, but all this is way deeper than what this article for Truth
Right.
was
No.
about.
Basically, to me, it said, you know, you've got to read Marx in a sense, you know,
Right.
and don't rely upon just these little memes that are out on the Facebook and various places. You've got, like you said, it's not just a T-shirt with a
Right.
with a little saying on it. It's actually, you have to study it. It's what we always talk about is critical thinking, going back and studying it, and what does it mean, and learn to come up with your own conclusions. Learn to think for yourself on some of these
Right.
things.
You know, see, the reason why this is controversial to say read Marx is because Marxism has such a long history that, and there's so many different interpretations that you almost sound like a rabid Christian when you say read Marx. It's like, don't
Go back to the Bible.
Yeah, it's like go back to the Bible. And I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
I'm saying if you want to understand Marx's theory and test it out and find out if there's any validity to it, you have to actually understand his theory. And there's been so much history of rewriting his theory and so much divergence in the history of Marxism that if you try to understand Marx by reading other Marxists or party newspapers or Lenin, you're not going to really understand what Marx was saying. I don't think you can even understand Lenin very well without having read Marx. For instance, his theory of imperialism, really you can't understand it very well, and it's misinterpreted quite a lot because people aren't reading Capital first.
Well, usually when you think about Marx on the meme level, and Lenin or communism or whatever it is, in today's society, you might be saying, I mean, I remember when I was growing up just talking about humanity, if I, you know, there's an old saying that's out there, but often I would be, you know, concerned about people living in poverty, racism, sexism, various things. But if I talked about those things, it was like, well, you sound like a communist, or you sound like a socialist, or you sound like a Marxist, you know?
Right.
And for me, it was kind of like, well, you know.
Well, then maybe I am.
Maybe I am, you know. I mean, I don't know what those things are,
Right.
but, you know, I began to look into those things. But if that is what Marxism is asking questions about, and there was a bishop, I can't remember, in Latin America, who said something about, you know, you call me a saint when I feed the poor, but you call me a communist when I ask why are they poor.
Right.
and so, I mean, that's kind of a little anecdotal thing, but at the same time, I'm not even sure that understanding, I mean, I think it's important to understand, but I'm not even sure that understanding capitalism in itself is necessary for a revolution.
Okay, but see, you just contradicted yourself, because I really like that joke, or that little saying.
Yeah.
You call me a saint when I try to feed the poor.
Yeah.
You call me a communist when I ask, why are they poor?
Right.
Marx asked, why are they poor?
Right.
And he helped to try to help people overcome their own conditions.
Right.
He was a revolutionary. He was not he didn't run a charitable foundation.
Well, you just said something different, though. You said he's a revolutionary because of the way he thinks.
Well,
Right?
he was revolutionary because of the way he thinks and because of what he did. I mean, he saw himself as
Okay.
revolutionary. He worked with revolutionary socialists. He was a critic of his own group. He was a critic of
Right.
socialism. And he asked that question, why are we poor? Why are workers debased?
Right.
He didn't just say workers are debased and we need to get them, higher wages. He said, why are workers debased? Why are the poor? Why is the poor poor? And he came up with some answers. And to find out whether or not you think Marx is worth anything, you need to understand.
No, I do think he's worth
But do you think his T-shirt image is worth something, or do you think Marx is worth something?
No, I think he's worth something, but I don't think that, like anything, okay, to become a revolutionary, you don't always have to have the knowledge of everything that's within all of literature to understand that, Marx was an observer of what was happening in his time. You can be an observer of what's happening in your time. As you begin to look at what's going on, you may come up with some of the creative ideas that happen. You find out that you're coming up with things that are similar to what Marx was doing or what other revolutionaries were doing, that there's a consciousness that somehow comes together that is feeding the same thought patterns because the conditions themselves lead you to that thought and that critical thinking, because you don't want to live in a world like that. And so now you begin to question, why is that happening?
So, okay, we could even leave the question about social change and politics and all of that aside, because I think our difference here isn't about that.
Right.
It's about how do you learn to do something, and how do you learn how the world is.
Well,
That and so
that's when you unzip and you find out that
well,
you,
right. But yeah, so like you're an artist,
Right.
Dan.
yeah.
You went to university and you learned about art and you learned practical skills on
Right.
involving
Right.
painting and sculpture and photography, and you also learned the theory behind some art schools and some art practices. There are artists who don't do that.
Right.
Can those artists produce works that are of value?
Yes.
They absolutely can.
Yeah.
They can. Can theorists or people who are writing about the world produce things that are of some value if they're critiquing conditions on the ground?
Right.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. Noam Chomsky is a good example. He has no theory as to how society works, really, but he's a great critic of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. inequality. But if you want to create a work of art within a tradition in order to change the tradition, you have to know the tradition.
Makes sense.
So an outsider, someone who is an outsider artist.
Like an alien.
Well, right. But there are outsider artists.
Yeah.
There's actually, it's become its own school, but it's not. They're not going to be, they may create a work of art that challenges some traditions, but they're not going to be able to, I think, maybe this is wrong. I mean, I think this is a weak metaphor I'm using, a weak analogy. They're probably not going to be able to change the rules of the tradition that they're outside of, and especially if they don't understand the tradition. So I'm arguing that in order to change capitalism, we have to understand what it is and have pretty well-defined theoretical understanding of what it is. Because, and for a lot of reasons, one is that's just how that's a good way to know things, but also because, unlike art, capitalism is logical, much more so than an art practice. It works based on numerical, quantitative calculations. So to understand how it works, you have to know that stuff too. And okay, now I'm done. I've gone on and on.
Well, no, that's good. I think it's very important. I would question a little bit about that it's logical and mathematical in a sense.
Well, look, the Nazis were logical.
Huh?
The Nazis were logical.
Right.
They weren't right. It wasn't just.
No, I'm not talking about it from that aspect.
Okay.
I'm talking about it from the... when we talk about capital has all these other theories outside of Marx, which is, this. All the economists that try to explain capitalism, and they have this theory and that theory, you know, monetary theory. All of them start with one premise: all things being equal. And all things are not equal, and we live in oftentimes what you're writing about in your book in the art world of fluxus. There's so many different things that are happening in the world that we can't literally say mathematically this is going to lead to this. I mean, there's an interesting thing. I was even thinking about your book. We've got about 3 minutes.
Okay.
I was thinking about your book, and the idea is that what if we had a story in which mathematically we went back into time, we could mathematically figure out the calculations of how history would work at a certain time, because now we could look back at hindsight. And learning and creating that formula and finding out how it was working each time, that he always came up with the same answer, and it was correct because we already knew that history. And then all of a sudden, now we could actually predict what was going to happen if we made choices, how the future would look. And I just thought, well, but something can throw a wrench in the middle of all of that. And economics is kind of like that. So those are some of the things that were going through my head. So I'm just, and we're coming to an end here, but I wanted to kind of just come back and say that I think what you are doing for people is to have people think about these things and come back in, take a look at them. Don't just discount it because you have feelings about it, right?
Right. Yeah, that's the main thing is a lot of arguments I make unfortunately turn out to be wrong. I've learned. But the best way to demonstrate that against me or against Marx or against any book other than my own, which this one is not logical. But the best way to understand things is to think them through and argue with them directly if possible. And when it comes to Marx, that means reading Marx. And I'll stop there.
No, we got 1 minute here. I just wanted to say again, Zero Books.
Yes.
Your website is?
Zero-books.net and douglaslain.com or .net.
Okay. And your book again is?
It's After the Saucers Landed is my new novel.
Okay. Well, I wanted to thank you for coming on the program. We could have a discussion, argue like we usually do about things. But this is how we learn from each other.
You got to have me back on just to talk about Marx. Just forget my books. We'll talk about Marx.
Thanks again, folks, for tuning in. This was Veterans for Peace Forum. I want to thank my producers, DiBella and Jim Lockhart, who have made this program possible, and Metro East Community Media. Thanks again.